Hello again everyone, and welcome back. My name is Esoro, and in this video, I'm excited to introduce the Cobra Lash Deadeye, a wickedly fast build capable of some ridiculous clear speed. It tears through and shatters every pack in sight with multiple projectiles that can chain up to 9 times each, unleashing destructive Herald Device explosions in their wake. We'll be utilizing an extremely fast whirling blades to cover huge amounts of ground in an instant, with all of this mobility and raw clear speed allowing us to farm maps exceptionally quickly and tackle just about every league mechanic with ease. The build also manages some impressive single target capability, able to take down fully juiced, high tier metamorphs in around 5 to 10 seconds. It can comfortably dole out enough damage to take down Guardians, Elder Slayers, and even Cyrus himself, with much of this destructive capability coming from our Claw, the Hand of Wisdom in action. With over 1,200 intelligence in the build, this weapon alone grants us more than 120 to 1,200 base lightning damage to our attacks. We can utilize items like Itziri's Promise and Incandescent Heart to scale this base damage into huge amounts of extra chaos damage. Cobra Lash also pairs unbelievably well with the Deadeye Ascendancy node, Ricochet. Each Cobra Lash projectile can chain up to 9 times with investment, meaning that our initial hit will be granted 90% more damage from just a single Ascendancy node, with each resounding chain still gaining the majority of that bonus damage, only lowering by 10% every time it hits a new enemy. Powering up Cobra Lash so heavily makes it quite the versatile offensive force, dishing out death and destruction to entire screens and bosses alike, all from a comfortable distance. With substantial DPS output comes a slightly reduced focus on defense. However, the build still manages to be fairly durable. Defensively, it can push towards 8,000 energy shield when fully optimized, and due to the Keystone Chaos Inoculation, we are 100% immune to chaos damage and the effects of poison. Combining that with our chest piece, Incandescent Heart essentially allows us to nullify 25% of the elemental damage we would have taken. We also have consistent access to the buffs Fortify and Elusive, further reducing the damage we take and increasing the chance that we dodge both attack and spell hits. Additionally, we have around a 40% chance to block and as much as 60% chance to evade when our flasks are up. And when we do get hit, we have a cast when damage taken Immortal Call, substantial energy shield leech, and a Vol Discipline. But even beyond all of these defensive layers, one of our most powerful tools is simply being able to keep our distance and deal damage from afar, staying out of direct danger when possible. And with such a fast movement skill, we can put almost instantaneous distance between us and a serious threat, allowing us to disengage, giving our energy shield time to recharge fully before we get back into the fight. This makes longer boss fights like Cyrus substantially easier, as we have access to infinite recovery that isn't flask based, assuming that we can avoid damage or leave combat for at least a few moments. The build can certainly tank some solid hits and bounces back very quickly. However, the current metagame is brutal, and certain endgame bosses and the odd metamorph combination can sometimes deal unbelievable amounts of damage in one shot. Keeping proper distance from extreme threats, manually dodging, and making full use of your energy shield recovery in longer fights will be crucial to your long-term survival with this build. At the time of recording, you can get this build functioning well and ready to map for a fairly inexpensive cost. Most of the uniques we'll be utilizing are incredibly inexpensive, including the endgame weapon and chest piece, with only a few uniques even proving to be moderately expensive. The main potential cost is optimizing our rare gear to have as much energy shield and intelligence as possible. Certain items like enchanted helmets, boots, and an Assassin's Mark ring can have a low barrier of entry, but can be quite expensive to fully optimize. As a result, you can get the core of the build running and push low and mid-tier maps on an exceptionally small budget. However, when trying to reach the recommended endgame selection of gear, you will almost certainly be pushing up towards the moderate expense category. Cobra Lash Deadeye encapsulates perfectly how I love to play Path of Exile, bolting across maps like an insane person, devastating entire screens and cutting down bosses with some wickedly fast attacks. Now that we've covered the absolute basics of the build, let's get into the fine details and discuss just how to make this build happen. Shortcuts to every section of the guide are available down below for easy navigation. When following along in the path of building, you'll be able to access leveling, mid-game, and endgame skill trees, which you can change like this. You will also have access to leveling, endgame, and optimized endgame gear sets that can be changed like this. Let's begin first with a brief overview of the endgame skill tree. Offensively, we'll be focusing on stacking as much intelligence, elemental and lightning damage, attack speed, critical strike chance and critical strike multiplier, and elemental resistance penetration. We have no offensively focused keystones to pick up with this build, but will certainly be allocating plenty of offensively based notables across every section of the skill tree. Defensively, the build will be focusing on scaling Energy Shield recharge rate, both Energy Shield and Mana Leech, some evasion rating here and there, and wants to scale Intelligence for defensive reasons as well. We will be picking up multiple defensive keystones, the first of which is Chaos Inoculation, which grants us complete immunity to chaos damage at the cost of reducing our life total to 1. We'll also be grabbing Ghost Reaver, which allows us to leech Energy Shield instead of life, and doubles our Energy Shield leech rate, but it comes at the cost of 50% less Energy Shield recharge rate. Despite these drawbacks, both keystones are well worth it for the practical defensive benefits that they grant. Having complete immunity to chaos damage is incredibly powerful defensively, and leeching Energy Shield constantly during combat at an increased rate is much more practical than waiting for it to recharge by itself. We'll also be picking up some added utility in the form of jewel sockets, with many of these being focused on simply socketing rare jewels that will scale our attack speed and critical strike multiplier as much as possible. 2 of our jewel sockets near the Ranger's starting area are prime candidates for the jewel Fertile Mind, which converts all that dexterity into intelligence that the build can scale extremely well. We'll also be picking up the Charisma cluster near the Ranger's starting area. It reduces the amount of mana that we reserve, allowing us to cram some expensive auras into the build. All this encapsulates the primary goals of our skill tree. We'll be moving from here into our Ascendancy, the powerful, offensively driven Deadeye. Our first node is going to be Gathering Winds, which grants us a bit of evasion rating, and the amazing buff Tailwind, which increases our action speed by 10% if we've used a skill in the last 4 seconds. Action speed is essentially a more multiplier to our attack and movement speed. The strength of the buff is directly affected by the amount of skills that we've used in the last 4 seconds, with a maximum of 10 skill usages contributing towards increasing the buff effect of Tailwind. With our fast attack speed, we can make some very good usage of Tailwind and often have 20% increased action speed. Next up is going to be the node Farshot, which increases the speed of our projectiles and causes them to deal more damage the further they travel. If our Cobra Lash projectiles chain, this does not reset the amount of distance an individual projectile has traveled total. The damage increases at a constant rate, with a maximum of 30% more damage dealt when the projectile travels at least 70 total units away from its origin point. A good frame of reference for this distance is going to be the middle of the life and mana orbs. Any enemies that you target from this distance will be taking right around the full amount of increased damage, and further incentivizes us to keep our distance from dangerous bosses and deal our damage from far away. Proceeding now onto our third node, Endless Munitions. Certainly the weakest node of our selection, but its purpose in the build is not to push damage, but to improve our clear speed capabilities. It grants us an additional guaranteed projectile, which is useful in all situations, especially when Dying Sun is out of charges. The added projectile helps us shred packs and large targets much more effectively, and makes it more likely for us to hit moving targets. The substantial increase to our area of effect also makes our Herald of Ice explosions much more effective, further boosting our clear speed. Endless Munitions' true strength becomes apparent when combined with Dying Sun. With 3 added projectiles, we can drop greater multiple projectiles from our Cobra Lash 6th link, and socket instead another DPS-focused support gem, which makes this Ascendancy node well worth having. Finally, that brings us to the beating heart of this build, the 4th and final Ascendancy node, Ricochet. It grants our Cobra Lash projectiles an additional chain, which we'll be combining with Cobra Lash's 5 inherent chains, and the Helmet enchantment, Cobra Lash chains 3 additional times, in total allowing each projectile to chain 9 times, resulting in Ricochet granting the initial hit an absurd 90% more damage bonus. Each individual projectile will almost never chain more than 3 or 4 times, meaning that we'll be getting a consistent 50 to 90% more damage against packs and a consistent 90% more damage against bosses. The power of this Ascendancy node cannot be overstated, and you'd be hard-pressed to find a single node in any Ascendancy that does as much DPS-based work as Ricochet does for Cobra Lash. When leveling this build and getting your Ascendancies, I would recommend taking Farshot first, followed by Ricochet, before getting Gathering Winds, and leaving Endless Munitions for last, as you'll most likely be using either lesser or greater multiple projectiles during the leveling process, making the additional projectile much less impactful at this stage. With that covered, it's time for us to forge onwards into the Pantheon selection. For the Major God, my top recommendation is to either go with Soul of Lunaris or Soul of Solaris. Both offer the build a solid array of defensive benefits, with Lunaris going in a more evasion-focused route, and Solaris focusing more on mitigating damage or preventing it outright. Whichever route you go, be sure to capture all of the additional souls to maximize the Pantheon's value to the build. For the minor god, I would have to go with Soul of Gruthgul, which provides us with some additional physical damage reduction for each hit we've taken recently, and with the optional soul captured, you'll be reducing the attack speed of anything that hits you by 8%, improving our ability to dodge upcoming attacks and potentially disengage from combat if we've just taken substantial damage. Pressing ahead next into the Bandit Choice for the build. While Alira remains a compelling choice for all crit-based builds, her buff simply doesn't do enough to be worth it to me. There are plenty of extra nodes on the tree that we would love to have the points for, and with every jewel socket, we can increase our potential damage substantially, meaning that every passive point is worth having. And I recommend putting each and every one of the bandits out of their misery before returning to town to collect your 2 passive points from Aramir. Let's march onward into the skills and links that fuel the build. We'll begin of course with our main Cobra Lash setup, which is going to be a 6-link composed of these gems. Both damage on full life and elemental damage with attacks massively increase our Cobra Lash's DPS and come with no downside in this build. Normally, damage on full life would require the player to maintain perfect health to gain the damage bonus. However, thanks to Chaos Inoculation, we are always at 1 life, which the game considers to be full life, granting us constant access to that huge damage bonus. Hypothermia is another solid DPS increase, but only against enemies that are chilled by our cold damage. Thus, the gem should only be used once you've gotten your single Call of the Brotherhood ring, which you can fortunately pick up anytime after level 20. Up until that point, you can run something like added lightning damage in Hypothermia's place. Nightblade support grants us access to the buff Elusive, which is a degrading buff that triggers when we deal a critical strike, beginning at full effectiveness and ticking down from there, reducing the strength of the buff it provides until it eventually reaches 0%, at which time dealing a critical strike will grant us another full power Elusive buff. The buff will begin at 130% due to the gem's inherent bonus to its own effect, and will grant us 52% movement speed, 26% chance to dodge attack and spell hits, and 130% increased critical strike multiplier. These bonuses will not be consistent and will go down as the buff degrades. Nightblade also increases our base critical strike chance significantly when Elusive is active. This buff is applied statically and will not go down as Elusive lowers in value. None of these benefits are tracked directly by path of building, and as such, I've added the average bonuses that we gain from Nightblade and Elusive to one of our jewels. And that brings us to our final gem, Inspiration Support. As we use Cobra Lash, we'll stack up to 5 inspiration charges, which combined grant us substantial increases to our critical strike chance and elemental damage. Inspiration Support also significantly reduces the mana cost of Cobra Lash, making it much easier to sustain mana, especially in the early and mid game. These inspiration charges will be up just about constantly, as we can attack more than 40 times before the charges are reset. Our next gem setup is going to be our movement skill, which is a Whirling Blades 3-link. Faster attacks simply makes Whirling Blades trigger a little bit more quickly, and Fortify granting us the Fortify buff whenever we hit any enemy with Whirling Blades. This will happen quite often while mapping, and will simply lower the amount of damage we take for almost no investment at all. Hastening on now to our auras, which will be a 4-link composed of these 4 gems. Herald of Ice drastically improves our clear speed and grants us a small chunk of cold damage. Wrath provides us with an absolute ton of added lightning damage, giving us another meaningful boost to our DPS. Vol Discipline has 2 portions. The Aura portion grants us some much needed flat energy shield, increases our energy shield recharge rate. Vol Discipline gives us a manually casted panic button that allows our energy shield to temporarily recharge without interruption. Linked to each of these auras is going to be the support gem Enlighten, preferably at level 3, though this can be used at level 2 temporarily while you level it up. This causes our auras to reserve less mana, and when combined with the Charisma cluster on the skill tree, we can comfortably run all 3 of these auras with no mana issues whatsoever. Next on the list is going to be our utility setup, which is composed of 3 different skill gems that don't need to be linked at all. First up, we have the totem skill Ancestral Protector, which needs to be placed somewhere near our character, and when active grants us 20% more attack speed, a genuinely respectable DPS boost for essentially no cost whatsoever. This is best used before and sometimes during intense combat situations, with blights, strong boxes, bosses, and metamorph fights being some of the best examples. For our next utility gem, we have the Aura Precision, specifically used at level 1. At low levels, Precision reserves virtually no mana, and grants us 40% increased critical strike chance for very little commitment. At the cost of only 22 mana, it's easy to recommend. For our final spot, we have the movement skill Flame Dash. While Whirling Blades is incredibly fast, it cannot pass through doors or cover gaps. That's where Flame Dash comes in, serving the build as a situational movement skill, making our mapping experience much more enjoyable. Moving along to our first cast when damage taken setup, which is going to be a 4-link composed of these gems at these specific levels. We want to keep cast when damage taken at level 1 in order to have it triggering as often as possible. Increasing the level of cast when damage taken increases the amount of damage needed to trigger it. Please keep in mind that any spells linked to cast when damage taken need to match or be lower than the level requirement of cast when damage taken itself, or they won't be triggered at all. Our first automatic cast will be the spell Immortal Call, which grants us a temporary buff that reduces the amount of physical and elemental damage we take. Our second automatic cast will be Cold Snap, which will occasionally cause us to gain frenzy charges as we map, increasing our attack speed by 12% and granting us 12% more damage while mapping at full frenzy charges. Our final automatic cast will be Tempest Shield, which provides us with a buff that damages nearby enemies when we block, and slightly increases our chance to block both attack and spell damage. And that brings us to our final gem setup, which will be a 4-link containing these gems. Beginning first with a second cast when damage taken gem at level 1 as well, which will be directly triggering a level 7 Wave of Conviction. Wave of Conviction's primary purpose is to apply the debuff Elemental Exposure onto enemies that it hits, drastically increasing our DPS against them. Our third link will be Summon Lightning Golem, which you can either choose to run at level 3 or level 20. At level 3, you won't be able to manually cast it yourself, but it will be occasionally cast for you by the cast when damage taken gem. This is the most convenient route to go. Alternatively, you can run the golem at level 20 and cast it yourself when it goes down. Regardless of your decision here, you'll want to be linking everything to a fully leveled Culling Strike. This will cause both the Wave of Conviction and Lightning Golem to automatically kill anything they hit that has less than 10% of its maximum life left. This includes all bosses and is invaluable in the game's most dangerous fights. And with that covered, the skills and links are completely wrapped up, and it's time for us to discuss the gear that makes the build as powerful as it is. When discussing prices for individual items, I will be using broad tiers of price rather than specific amounts in Chaos. All prices in Path of Exile are subject to supply and demand, and may see changes following this video's release or in future leagues. The price tiers will be cheap, 0 to 20 Chaos, moderate, 21 to 100 Chaos, and expensive, being anything over 100 Chaos in price. We'll begin first and foremost with our endgame weapon selection, the Godly Hand of Wisdom in action, which incredibly is available for quite cheap. This claw increases our attributes and elemental damage and stacks both attack speed and flat lightning damage based upon the amount of attributes the build has. And we have plenty of attributes, with over 1,200 intelligence when the build is optimized. This claw alone adding over 120 to 1,200 flat lightning damage to our attacks. Without a doubt the best in slot option for this build, and a disgustingly powerful one at that. If you have the funds and are looking to fully optimize the build, you can pick up a corrupted version with one of the following implicits. All of these corruptions are very strong, but will increase the price of the claw accordingly. Up next is going to be our endgame shield, which is going to be a rare spirit shield with a flexible price tag. Our primary focus is going to be stacking as much energy shield, intelligence, and resistances as possible, ideally eventually trying to get a shield that has at least 250 to 300 energy shield or more, and has 40 or more intelligence. An alternative option exists for those with more money than God, the Shielded Series Reflection. It offers an impressive amount of just about every helpful stat imaginable and makes us completely curse immune. It is easy to recommend as best in slot, but only for those who can afford its huge price tag. Next on the agenda is our helmet selection, which is going to be a flexibly priced rare helmet with an energy shield base. This selection is going to be limited by our ideal helmet enchantment, which is Cobra Lash Chains, either 2 or 3 additional times, depending on which version of the enchantment you look to pick up. This enchantment combined with our Ascendancy is so powerful that it comes extremely recommended. Fortunately, at the time of recording, there is a huge variety of helmets with one of these enchantments available for quite cheap. Our ideal base is going to be a Hubris Circlet with multiple enchanted examples currently available for only cheap to moderate price. Both versions of this enchantment will serve the build just fine, making picking up a helmet even more flexible. Our primary focus for this helmet will be very similar to the shield, stacking as much energy shield, intelligence, and resistances as possible. The listed secondary focuses here will make this item much more expensive and harder to find. Mainly just try to shoot for a helmet that has 250 or more energy shield, and as much intelligence and as many resistances as possible. Leaping forward now onto our body armor selection, which is going to be the strong and incredibly cheap Incandescent Heart, which you can find unlinked for practically free, 5 linked for cheap, and 6 linked for an expensive but altogether quite reasonable cost. It grants us a very solid amount of energy shield and armor, and defensively works incredibly well with Chaos Inoculation, essentially nullifying 25% of the elemental damage we would have taken by turning it into chaos damage that we're completely immune to. The chest piece also causes us to gain up to 20% of our elemental damage as extra chaos damage, and with our ridiculous amount of base lightning damage, this single stat does some serious work for the build, and you'll really want to be getting this stat as close to 20% as possible. I can't recommend this chest piece highly enough due to its affordability and raw defensive and offensive power. If you're low on funds, you can utilize the cheap Prophecy Jeweler's Touch to instantly create a 5-link chest piece with only a single Jeweler's Orb. Combining this with the already very cheap Incandescent Heart will allow you to get mapping on an insanely low budget. This is my primary recommendation, however you can also choose to buy a cheap Tabula Rasa for an instantaneous 6-link with no stats, or you can comfortably farm it in the Act 9 area, the Blood Aqueducts, by farming for 9 Humility Divination cards and then turning them into Navali. With that covered, it's time to put on some gloves. The cheaply priced Shaper's Touch Crusader gloves, which provide the build with a bit of armor and energy shield, but most notably scale a variety of helpful stats based upon the amount of attributes the build has, granting us, when the build is fully optimized, around 2400 accuracy rating, 100 mana, 42% increased energy shield, and 240% increased evasion rating. This one item instantly bringing our hit chance up to 100% and increasing our maximum energy shield substantially, as well as making us much more difficult to hit. If you're looking to fully optimize the build, you can pick up a corrupted version of these gloves for a much more expensive cost. You'll be looking for the following corruptions. If you go the curse route, you'll want to be anointing your amulet with Whispers of Doom. With that, let's hop right into the boots. We'll be looking to pick up a flexibly priced, rare pair of boots with an energy shield base, ideally a pair of Sorcerer's Boots. Our primary focus will sound very familiar. You'll want to stack as much energy shield, intelligence, and resistances as possible. You can of course look to pick up some movement speed. However, most of our time traversing the map will be spent using Whirling Blades, making movement speed a lot less necessary to have in the build. Try to shoot for around 150 energy shield or more, and try to get as much intelligence and resistances as you can. When you're looking to enchant this boot, here are some of the best options. My top recommendation is going to be taking the increased attack speed if possible. It is one of the most consistently available buffs and makes mapping that much more enjoyable. And with that, let's discuss our amulet selection. The moderately priced Astramentus Onyx Amulet, a very odd amulet that pumps up all of our attributes by absurd amounts. This amulet is the perfect candidate for intrinsic catalysts, which increase attribute modifiers on a ring, amulet, or belt by up to 20%. A perfectly rolled and qualitied Astramentus will increase all of our attributes by 139, playing exceedingly well off of our other items like Shaper's Touch and Hand of Wisdom in action, increasing our damage and defensive capabilities. For this build, Astramentus is essentially best in slot, and only an absurdly expensive rare amulet could even dream of keeping up. An option too expensive and unavailable to really recommend to anyone. We're going to want to be anointing this amulet as well, and I have a couple of good options for you. For exceptionally cheap, you can anoint Claws of the Pride for a violet, and an amber, granting you 25% increased damage and 15% increased attack speed if you've used a movement skill in the last 4 seconds. Quite the powerful upgrade for only a couple of chaos. There genuinely aren't a lot of good options that can compete with the value and power that this cheap anointment grants. However, for an expensive cost, you can anoint Ethereal Feast for a golden, a silver, and an amber oil. This will consistently increase our attack speed while leeching energy shield, and substantially increases the amount of energy shield that we can leech per second. A very well-balanced anointment both offensively and defensively. And for our third and final anointment, we have our most expensive option, Whispers of Doom, for a golden, a golden, and a black oil. This allows you to apply a second curse to your enemies, and is the largest available DPS increase from a single anointment. If you go this route, you'll want to be adding a second curse via a corrupted Shaper's Touch ideally, with the most powerful available curse being Elemental Weakness. However, all three of these anointments are quite powerful and will serve the build well in different ways. Advancing onward now to our rings, with our first selection being the very cheap called the Brotherhood 2-Stone Ring. It bestows some resistances, intelligence, mana regen, and increased lightning damage, which all help the build. However, the main reason we have the ring is for the damage conversion. Turning a large chunk of our lightning damage into cold damage gives us the ability to more consistently freeze and chill our enemies, making boss fights easier and allowing us to take full advantage of both Hypothermia and Herald of Ice. We also gain a very meaningful amount of DPS through the conversion, as our sources of non-chaos damage as extra chaos damage, such as Atziri's Promise and Incandescent Heart, apply to all stages of conversion and essentially become more powerful when our damage is converted into a different type. As with many previous items, there are a fair amount of useful corruptions you can look for if you have the funds and don't need the resistances on the ring. All of these options will serve the build well in different ways. Our second ring will be a moderately priced Shaper-influenced rare ring. The base type itself can be anything at all, but a Moonstone, Diamond, or one of the many resistance-focused bases will serve the build best. Our main focus will be on getting one modifier, curse enemies with level 8 or level 12 Assassin's Mark on hit. Having this curse in the build is crucial, as it dramatically increases our critical strike chance and increases the amount of damage we deal substantially. This is our top objective, and even if you need to pick up a ring that has none of our secondary focuses, it's better to have Assassin's Mark in the build than not have it at all. If you do have the money, try to find an Assassin's Mark ring that has as much energy shield, intelligence, and resistances as possible. With that being said, let's move on to our final piece of core gear, the belt, with our top selection being the moderately priced Cyclopean Coil leather belt. When rolled well, it can notably grant us up to 15% increased attributes. This is another amazing candidate for the use of intrinsic catalysts to increase its attribute modifiers, with a perfect and qualityed example giving us 18% increased attributes. You'll want to prioritize getting a coil that has a high roll on percentage increased attributes. The belt also gives us complete shock immunity and increases our damage by 1% for every 5 of our lowest attributes. And now that we've gotten our belt sorted, it's time for us to pick up some flasks. Right off the bat, we're going to have the moderately priced Dying Sun Ruby Flask. It causes us to fire 2 additional projectiles with every attack during the flask's effect, making mapping much smoother, and comes highly recommended for those wanting to slice through multiple packs with ease. The flask also causes us to take 20% reduced fire damage and very slightly increases our area of effect. Alternatively, in this slot, you can run Wise Oak for the extra elemental resistance penetration and reduced elemental damage taken. This is a great flask to swap in for dedicated boss fights, especially when going against Guardians, Elder Slayers, and bosses like Cyrus, Shaper, and Elder. If you go this route, you'll want to ensure that your uncapped lightning and cold resistances are equal to each other. This will cause you to penetrate up to 15% of both the enemy's cold and lightning resistances, and reduces the amount of cold and lightning damage you take by 10% during the flask's effect. Ideally, you want to match all 3 of your uncapped resistances. However, this can be a little tedious to pull off. In our second slot, we're going to be running the moderately priced Cinder Swallow, which during its flask effect grants us Onslaught and allows us to recover up to 3% of both our mana and energy shield for each enemy we kill. This allows us to recover much faster when we take significant damage while mapping. Cinder Swallow also has access to a single veiled modifier with a limited pool of mods. We'll be looking for one in particular, up to 80% increased critical strike chance during flask effect. This flask is powerful both offensively and defensively and comes highly recommended. Alternatively, you could consider swapping in a cheap Rumi's Concoction if you wanted to push the build in a more defensive direction. Our third flask is going to be our most crucial, and it's the cheap Diamond Flask, which makes our critical strike chance lucky. This essentially causes the game to roll twice and then take the best result when checking to see if we crit. This drastically increases our effective critical strike chance, which heavily increases our damage output as a result. When buying or crafting a Diamond Flask, there are a lot of solid prefixes that will work well, though I tend to prefer reduced charges used. For the suffix, we'll want to be covering either immunity to bleed or immunity to freeze and chill. For the 4th slot, we're going to be utilizing the potent Itziri's Promise, which you can get for quite cheap. We gain no direct benefit from any aspect of this flask besides the damage bonus, but it's too good to pass up. Be sure to prioritize getting a maximum roll on the elemental damage's extra chaos damage. The physical damage roll has virtually no impact on the build whatsoever and can be completely ignored. For our 5th and final flask, we have a cheap Jade Flask, preferably with the prefix 20% chance to gain a charge when you deal a critical strike, which gives you the ability to recover full uses of the flask, even against lone single target bosses. For the suffix, you'll want to cover either freeze or bleed immunity, whichever one you didn't get on your diamond flask. I would also recommend having an extra silver or granite flask that has curse immunity as its suffix. This is amazing to swap in for either Cinder Swallow or Itziri's Promise while running maps under the effect of a curse. This is a good time to mention the map modifiers that the build struggles with. Both physical reflection and heavily reduced recovery rate of energy shield maps are tough but doable, with the only mod we directly cannot do being elemental reflection. And with that covered, we've arrived at our true last stop of the gear, and that will be the jewels. We'll begin with our 2 fertile mines, which can be picked up for quite cheap and should be socketed into these 2 locations on the skill tree. You'll want to get the best intelligence roll possible, and if you have the money and you're looking to optimize the build further, these jewels are yet another good target for corruption. Try to get just one that specifically has corrupted blood cannot be inflicted on you. This is certainly not required, but prevents some occasional annoying deaths. This is especially nice to have when fighting Cyrus, as he can apply corrupted blood with certain attacks. This one implicit corruption can make that fight go much smoother. Next, I'll be covering our rare jewels, which will be flexibly priced Viridian jewels that focus on the following stats. You want to be stacking as much relevant attack speed and critical strike multiplier as possible. This is also a fantastic place to shore up some of your resistances. And for our final jewel, we have the optional and likely expensive Watcher's Eye. Due to the amount of auras we have in the build, there are a huge amount of available options that will serve the build very well. If you look to pick up a Watcher's Eye, look to see what's available for cheap and try to get as many relevant modifiers as your budget allows. And there you have it. The primary gear selections are completely wrapped up, and it's time for us to cover some leveling tips and leveling gear recommendations. Fortunately for us, Cobra Lash can be purchased from Nessa after reaching the very first town. Cobra Lash can absolutely be scaled from this point onward, and the build can generally be put together piece by piece using the recommended gem setups. During the leveling process, I would absolutely recommend using lesser and eventually then greater multiple projectiles in your Cobra Lash setup. This will make your progression through the axe much smoother. You'll also want to hold off on running hypothermia and damage on full life until we picked up Chaos Inoculation and Call of the Brotherhood. In their stead, you can run things like slower projectiles, added lightning or added cold damage, elemental focus, or faster attacks. Running the remainder of the core gem setup, like elemental damage with attacks, Nightblade, and Inspiration support comes highly recommended. You want to make use of some of the auras, like Wrath, Herald of Ice, or Herald of Thunder, and a low-level precision during the leveling process. Additionally, running things like Whirling Blades and Ancestral Protector will make your life a lot easier while leveling and fighting bosses. You may also want to set up the core portions of the cast when damage taken setups when it becomes possible in the mid-game, prioritizing getting at least Wave of Conviction and Immortal Call. Taking a look at the leveling skill trees. When you're putting together the build, you'll want to focus on scaling damage and temporarily building up a generic life pool. It can be difficult to transition early into Chaos Inoculation, and I recommend holding off on making the switch to Energy Shield until you have the build most of the way, if not completely through the main axe. From there, you can swap out of your leveling gear and into the first iteration of endgame items. As a result, you won't be picking up any notables directly until the core axe are complete and you've gotten the majority of your Energy Shield gear. At that time, you'll need to respec around 10 to 15 points on the skill tree that were picked up to boost our life pool. Just through completing quests, you should have plenty of respec points lying around to make that happen. We'll then be reinvesting those points into Chaos Inoculation, Ghost Reaver, Energy Shield nodes, more jewel sockets, and damage. And that brings us to our recommended leveling gear selection. We'll have many of the usual cheap suspects, such as Gold Rim, Tabula, Lactonial Caress, Wanderlust, Itziri's Foible, and Prism Weave. You shouldn't really be having any mana issues once you've picked up the node Soul Raker. However, a cheap Thief's Stormhead Ring is incredible for the leveling process and allows you to recover an immense amount of both life and mana very quickly. For a weapon, I recommend using any decent claw up until level 22. You can use rares you find on the ground or something like a cheap last resort temporarily before eventually equipping a cheap Hand of Thought and Motion Blinder. This should hold you over just fine until you can equip your Hand of Wisdom in action at level 68. For a shield, I recommend running the cheap Lycosity for most if not all the leveling process. Be sure to run flasks like Wise Oak, Quicksilver, Diamond, Silver, and perhaps something like a Jade Flask during the leveling process. Feel free to also socket in Fertile Mind Jewels and Solid Rare Jewels as you get them. And that honestly just about wraps up everything. For those that have been asking, here are the MTXs that were used in the footage. Cobra Lash was an absolute blast to play, slicing through maps at a blistering pace and slaughtering countless bosses and metamorphs alike. It was even my first build to take down Cyrus, and it did so quite well. With some investment, this skill really is an amazing all-in-one. Its ability to both clear and kill bosses exceptionally quickly makes it extremely easy to recommend, and I hope you'll give the build a try. A huge thank you goes to all of my patrons for their continued support of the channel. It's truly appreciated. Thank you everyone. Special recognition goes to the following for their dedicated contributions that make this content possible. A huge thank you to Onlei Huang Bao, Andrew Miller, Bloody, Chris Sherrick, Christopher Cravey, Christopher Murdoch, Dan Hamilton, Daniel Wig, David Lacamy, Efren Valladares, Eric Meyer, Gareth Thomas, Jacob Michael Davey, Mikey Wilson, Vankshire, and Zolaris. All of the support is truly appreciated. If you'd like to be credited at the end of each of my videos or join our Discord server for Path of Exile and channel discussion, consider checking out the Patreon link in the description. Finally, if you made it this far, thank you so much for watching. I hope the video proved helpful and entertaining. If you have any questions, please leave them down below and I'll do my best to answer. And as always, I've been Esoro, and I will see you guys in the next video.